So our next presentation, Streamlining Authentication, Going Faster with FIDO2, is being presented by Nick Steele, who's head of research at Superlunar. So Nick, here you go.
Thanks so much, David. Hi, everybody. I'm Nick Steele. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of, I don't know, older side of FIDO2. I mean, it's still pretty new, but you know, there's some nice bits. I've been talking about FIDO2 and WebAuthn for a fairly long time now, it feels like. Currently, I'm the head of research at this company called Superlunar, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But currently, I'm the co-chair of the WebAuthn working group with Matt Miller, as he mentioned before, and I've also been an invited expert on the WebAuthn working group team for I think 4 years now. But you know, the spec started in 2017. When I started, it was pretty rough, and now it's pretty nice. And the interesting rough bits are really you know, on the enterprise side now. So we're going to talk a bit about that, but this is going to be a pretty general talk. To say a bit more about what I'm doing now, I started a private research group mostly focused on analytics, monitoring of blockchain work, and doing some identity stuff, mostly in the Web 2 space, not the Web 3 identity going on. But I'm not here to talk to you about blocks or chains. You could talk to me later about that if you want. But most of the team I work with now kind of comes from this identity background, either at Cisco and AWS or on the DARPA side as well. And then Immunity and Leviathan were a bit more applied offensive identity security, which is really interesting. So I come from a pretty heavy identity background, and I'm excited to kind of lay out where MFA and FIDO2 is at, and what I'm kind of interested in talking about today, which is getting FIDO2 faster and faster. So we're going to talk about how we can do that in different types of organizations. This is a fairly high-level talk. And then I'll talk a bit about how passkeys and conditional UI, which Matt Miller touched on earlier, and how this kind of fits into the story as I see it now. I think it's still a bit subjective because passkeys and conditional UI are really still coming together. So, I mean, why are we talking about FIDO2 here? I mean, under the premise that FIDO2 has changed how we think and perform authentication on the web, then you know, boundaries, security boundaries, auth boundaries are changing. The threat landscape for us starts to change a bit. And when we talk about FIDO2, compared to other forms of MFA, it's actually pretty different, and it allows us to do some really interesting things. So let's talk about what's working so far with FIDO, what's holding us back in the space. We'll talk about some other forms of MFA, and we'll talk about how we can improve the current FIDO2 experience by smoothing out some of the harder bits, which we touched on kind of in the questions as well in the last talk. Things like attestation are still pretty rocky. But the improvements over the last year or so have been really, really good. And we'll talk a bit about those passkeys and conditional UI, which is stuff coming on down the road, and it's going to be really cool. But namely, the takeaway here should be we're talking about getting to passwordless. Passkeys and conditional UI, these next steps for FIDO2 are going to get us to passwordless, but it's important now that we talk about less passwords. Most orgs that are thinking about implementing FIDO2 aren't thinking about passkeys. They shouldn't be thinking about passkeys. They should be thinking about the best experience that they could provide for FIDO2 as it starts today. So let's talk about classical MFA and the improvements in there and how FIDO2 kind of fits into this. When I talk about classical MFA, what I'm really talking about are transports like SMS, OTP, TOTP, any push-based authentication, any MFA modality that requires us to still use passwords. Can't be used with single factor. FIDO2 is built to handle single factor, so these classical ones are built to handle the insecurities of passwords. So it really stands out. That being said, classical MFA is going pretty darn well. 3 out of 4 Americans now actually use 2FA, at least some of the time. This tends to skew younger, and actually, interestingly, in here, if you read this Ipsos and Google password top line, I agree with Bob. Did anyone see Bob Lord's keynote? I totally agree earlier. It's like we got to be publishing more statistics in general. But this Ipsos Google paper is a great talk. 3 out of 4 Americans use it. It tends to be younger Americans. It tends to be folks that are students, that are working first-time jobs. We've seen a rise in the amount of people using it pretty normatively against the statistics here. So around 72, 73% often using it. These younger users, which is kind of interesting, tend to reuse passwords more than their older counterparts. But 66% are using random passwords, and 44% are using Password Manager, which is great. It seems like it's risen a lot in the past couple years, especially if you've seen what's going on in the space. So not only are they using it, but generally they find it pretty trustworthy. And coming from a couple years ago, where people were asking me like, oh, but Nick, the biometrics, they're being sent to the cloud. What if a robber comes into my house? This is a real question. What if a robber comes into my house and steals my fingers? There are bigger problems to deal with. But anyhow, for the most part, they trust it, and it's been a bit of a forcing function. I think Google, Apple, the platform vendors have done a really good job of getting people on board and feeling safe using it. So we've also seen this, and this may not seem like a big thing off the bat, but we've seen a bit more streamlining with 2FA modalities. We used to see these big NASCAR-like logos where you would be presented with multiple different types of SMS, and now we do a pretty good job. This is an image from Okta's SSO flow, who I think does a really slick job of figuring out that, it's like, I want to use FIDO2, put me through the FIDO2 flow. And this is really good for most flows. This doesn't work in all flows. In some browsers, FIDO2 there's no way to remove some of the interactions of like making sure I click through it. But this is great for push and SMS modalities. But it also, push and SMS, and I'll touch on this later, it's still a paid-for modality in a lot of cases, which makes adoption kind of hard in those SMBs that I believe Bob was talking about earlier. And Dashlane and 1Password, other password managers are getting into the space. They started with TopP, and now they're starting to get interested in FIDO, especially passkeys. So seeing these other companies that are now getting adopted start to play in the space is a really, really good sign. So while there's good things, things that aren't going well still, enrollment is really, really difficult. Getting users to get onboarded with FIDO2 or 2FA in general, classical MFA, is still really difficult. Here's a usability study from 2019, and we can still see that U2F, which we can infer is also kind of push-related here, or sorry, FIDO2-related here, has the worst usability score among users. It takes a long time, and it's hard for users to get enrolled originally. And then once they get enrolled, for organizations, it's actually pretty difficult to manage that life cycle. Over 35% of IT tickets in one case, and we see this pretty much on average across the industry. Over 35% of tickets generally involve MFA lifecycle management, whether that's enrolling users, updating their status, or unenrolling them from the system. And not all MFA flows are really the same. We touched on that usability note, but the best ones that we have now in the classical MFA setting tend to be ones we have to pay for. So we tend to take this for granted in Western markets. But in markets and smaller businesses where using flows like SMS and push and security tokens actually have an overhead business expense, this is pretty hard to get adoption. And the flows can generally be disjointed. Not all browsers have the same flow. Matt talked earlier about how Mozilla currently doesn't have WebAuthn support. They had the same cases with U2F for a long time, not Mozilla, but generally browsers had different flows. And that still kind of stands with FIDO2, but definitely with other modalities, this is the case. So this is why SMS and push are great because they're out of band, but they end up introducing a lot of overhead. And kind of the worst note here is passwords generally are still considered easier in a lot of cases. But I'm trying to be positive here, and I'll show you what's kind of emerging in the space. Well, 61% of users have been using OAuth this year. This is up from 20-30% even like 3 years ago, and I think a lot of this is just from the ease of use of using other platforms. But generally, people don't want to use passwords. They want to take the quickest way in. We're also starting to see a lot more of this single-factor login flow. The majority of the banks in US are actually using biometrics with a single-factor step. If you have Chase, Bank of America, SEFCU, any large bank, for the most part, is going to start accepting biometrics or Touch ID if they're not already. We also see that mobile phone traffic continues to eclipse desktop traffic, so people are interested in using the their mobile device to log in, which is great because it's a great platform for using passwordless or single-factor auth flows. And we're starting to see these true passwordless transports modalities like passkeys and conditional UI start to get developed and start to roll out. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think that this says, generally, that people are comfortable with using biometrics. Users are being treated with, a fair amount. Bob also touched on this earlier. We assume users don't understand what's going on with password lists, but I think they're really just looking for the easy flow in, and I think they're ready to start having faster experiences where, we can start getting them down the ramp to true passwordless. But this starts at 502. And it is a bit of an event horizon where it's like the closer we get to things like passkeys and traditional UI, the faster the user is going to have to slide into this. And we have to act a bit like a forcing function and start getting users down that fast ramp as we start moving towards passkeys and conditional UI being standard across, basically across browsers, across clients, across authenticators. So this feels a bit like a cop-out, but it's true. I honestly would follow what a lot of the leaders in the space are doing right now already. Google, Microsoft have been doing great examples of setting up FIDO2 flows, showing how 2FA and MFA as a whole can fit into these auth flows. And they tend to work for different scales of businesses as well. Okta, Duo, or I guess Cisco Umbrella, I don't know what they're calling themselves now. I've been gone. But generally, other SSO providers have a flow that works really well. GitHub, eBay, on the more retail side, have really nice flows. And you can go in and get a free account and check out how WebAuthn and U2F flows look with these different platforms. But I've done this for you already, so it's okay. You don't have to go out. Thank you, Nick. You're welcome. The big breakdown here I kind of put is through design, engineering, and security. So this is going to be a kind of a three-part trident. You're gonna want to have your design and engineering teams in here, and when you're thinking about design, this starts with empathy, and this starts with your design team and you figuring out what does your workforce look like, or what does your fleet look like? Who do your users wear? In a lot of cases. So are they Apple users generally? Are they mobile users? Does your org, if you're an enterprise, use security keys? Do you allow for mobile phones? Things that are going to affect your build are going to be the first thing you want to think about if you haven't already implemented FIDO2. And thinking about where your traffic is coming from. So I mentioned those mobile devices. If you're seeing traffic coming from mobile devices or even from certain regions, you're going to want to have an experience that fits the majority of your users. It doesn't need to fit all use cases, but it needs to fit your customer. And you're going to need to account for that in the experience that you offer them. And we're going to talk about this a bit when I talk about passkeys and conditional UI later, but this is really going to change. If you're an enterprise, if you use password managers, this is going to have an effect too. Where do you want to store these keys? What does this look like in your rollout for the org? On the engineering side, shout out to Arnar, he's in the room. Cookies, macaroons. You should be using something for persistence if you're not already. This is going to help you get in this flow. Matt was talking about this a bit earlier, where we could look at things like get transports early on to make design decisions. Once you make those decisions, you can store them in a cookie or a scope macaroon, so you could figure out what kind of experience you want to present these users, and this is going to be something that could get blown away, and also something that could get read. So it's like when you make these cookies and when you store these for the purpose of producing your flow, use them responsibly. Don't put any you shouldn't be putting personal information. It should be at most what kind of authenticator they want, or what kind of authenticator transport they generally want, and how they're maybe the public key if you need to do anything else. But there's a couple ways you could design these. Start thinking about your auth boundaries. This is going to come down to engineering and security. Start thinking about where you need to do step up. If you have these persistent or long-lived sessions, your auth boundaries can change. GitHub does a great example here. They do kind of this road bump authentication, or speed bump authentication with with security keys. So I don't need to, I could have a 24-hour session that I extend to maybe a 3-day, week-long session where I am asking for that security key to verify the user rather than having the user go through a whole first factor, second factor flow all the time. And again, account for your client types. If you have information about the demographics and cohorts that are using your site, if you have users that are generally under 34 or over 55, generally using like a MacBook or Windows PC. Depending on what they're using, you may want to flag your rollout and show them different experiences within there. And you can use their cookies to do that. You could also just, you could use other forms of user query to find that. And finally, for security considerations, you should be allowing multiple methods and keys if you aren't already. I find it silly that some sites are just like, you can only have 5. Why did you choose that number? Just because. There's no reason you shouldn't be adding more keys most of the time. I've seen some reasons, but generally you want to be able to provide multiple methods, especially depending on how you want to be accountable for recovery. If you don't want to deal with a full account recovery flow where a user comes to you and they lost their keys, lost their phone, ended up naked on a beach somewhere in Cabo, and can't recover back to your site, you may want to be able to fall back to something like TOTP or some other site where they may have a seed stored. So that's really like one of the big points here. But Matt touched on this before. Depending on your organization, you may not have to do attestation as well. Attestation is going to add additional steps to your login. And as I mentioned before, we're going for speed. So if your organization doesn't need to handle attestation, just prevent interactions that don't need to occur. And make sure you're presenting interactions that aren't going to end up in these states where the user is going to have to come to you and say, I think I screwed it up, or I didn't enroll because this became too difficult. This is really going to be a 3-person sweaty handshake. And it's security's job here to be that glue and be kind of the middle handshake where you keep design and engineering on task, and also understanding of what you're trying to accomplish with FIDO2. The security team really can't work alone with this. If you're implementing this within your org, especially from scratch, this is going to be a much larger endeavor than your security organization alone. And it's your job, especially on the security side, to make sure that security considerations, especially for how we roll out FIDO2, and also how we present it, is done in a secure, safe, and empathetic manner. So to touch on single factor a little bit, I mentioned at the beginning, passwordless is where we want to end up, but this starts with less passwords. So when I talk about adding those speed bumps and having longer-lived sessions, promoting FIDO2 through the login UI, which folks talked about earlier today at the keynotes, being able to show enrollment flows and not add obstacles, like things like going through attestation or having other flows presented that the user doesn't necessarily need to adhere to, are going to be really important. Make it fast. Make enrollment easy. And you start figuring out what you need to do to get towards single factor. As I said, it's going to be you, design, and engineering probably working on this together. And you have to figure out what your goal is. What do you want that passkey and conditional UI rollout to look like? And who's involved with that first milestone. So we're really awaiting the arrival of FIDO2 single factor here, but we can get pretty darn close right now. So start designing for that. 5 minutes? Perfect. So passkeys and conditional UI are kind of the herald of Galactus, the password eater. That's a good reference. I like that. I thought more people would laugh. Passkeys, I think Christian Brand, who's there, tweeted yesterday. They're added to Chrome. They are rolling out. They're coming out the door, and they're getting real close. And you can go to Matt Miller and Tim Capalli's site, passkeys.dev, to start reading up on them now. And you can see conditional UI up in the corner and how it's going to present itself alongside passkeys. We're going to be able to have users directly enroll through there. This is going to really present a great experience for users because it decreases the friction of that worst part that I keep talking about, enrollment. As we move closer towards passkeys, we're going to start seeing this act as a bit of a forcing function, similar to how Apple, you may have seen on the slide earlier, started to get people to enroll in iCloud 2FA. Apple says that they have over 95% coverage of 2FA for users in iCloud, which is quite wild. How did they do that? They made users do it. And while I'm not saying we have to go out there and whip users into start using FIDO2, having passkeys there and available through a kind and empathetic UI, which helps them enroll and helps them get into it, and really start seeing the use. And hey, look, my passkey's right there, and I can use it on my device, or I can use it from my phone. It's going to be really important. But there needs to be no question about me doing it. I don't want to be there and like, what the frick is that? It just showed up on my phone. I don't know what's going on. Being able to present users with the information they need and not documentation that they need is going to be a really difficult balance to strike. But it does provide a unified experience across these devices. And it does help deal with that account recovery problem that I think a lot of folks are really going to struggle with. And it's starting to roll out. But as I said, we can get pretty far on our own, and we can start working towards passkeys right now. It's less passwords, not passwordless all the way yet for the majority of organizations. The hairy bit, so conditional UI, this is still a bit of the Wild West. There's a lot of unexplored area here in user experience, so we're really doing this all together. And there's still work to be done. It is a spec in motion. And passkeys aren't going to work for everyone, at least all the time. You can use passkeys in organizations like hospitals and government orgs and NGOs in some cases, but you have to account for those with context. And that's something, again, that you're going to want to work with engineering and design on to figure out how you want to add passkeys to your site. John from Google talked on this earlier, but vulnerable groups may not have access to passkey-enabled devices as well all the time. Generally, unhoused, unhomed individuals can lose or not have access to their phone for 3-4 weeks at a time. So in those cases, passkeys generally aren't going to work off the bat, so we want to figure out how we can have other flows, other modalities for 2FA or MFA. Matt touched on this before, but we have the WebAuthn community group in the W3C space. And if you're not already a FIDO Alliance member, I highly recommend joining. That's where a lot of the sausage gets made on how we're figuring out what the next steps are. So to wrap up, let's build for that passwordless future with what's working now. And let's understand that users are comfortable with MFA and biometric login. In fact, they want it because they want faster and reliable login. And we can decrease friction and increase a lot of the speed of that login right now through helping increase the speed of things like enrollment, to help increase login speed by knowing how the user is going to log in, and by working with teams in our own orgs to help make this experience work. So start thinking about what that looks like for your org as well. If it's an internal FIDO2 rollout, it's going to look very different than an external one. But when conditional UI and passkeys really come in the mainstream and help lower that enrollment barrier, especially for external users, this is going to be huge, and we want to facilitate that transition onto FIDO2 with passkeys. So that's my talk. Thank you so much.
So we just have time for one question. I'm going to take it here from online. It
No
says,
questions. No, sorry.
For relying party deploying biometrics in a mobile app, how do you tell they are running FIDO behind the scene?
That's a really good question. So generally, if they're using biometrics or they're using the internal UI, there's a good chance that unless you've installed something on top of it, you're going to be using FIDO2 because it's going to be something that the platform provider is presenting for the purposes of FIDO2. You'll generally know as the user or otherwise if you're using another type of biometric provider because it will require additional hardware or software.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you again, Nick. Appreciate your insights.